No one could bear the sheer emptiness that man carried within him, until a young housekeeper arrived at his home with a story he was not prepared to hear, and the secret she brought from the past would either bury them both or set them free forever. If you enjoy stories of love and romance, watch until the very end. You won't regret it. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where you're listening to this beautiful story from. Let's continue. No one could ever bear the size of Adrian Cromwell. It wasn't his body, although he was imposing, sculpted as ancient statues are sculpted, with a brutal elegance that drew attention wherever he appeared. Nor was it his fortune, which surpassed figures the newspapers estimated and always undershot, numbers that made politicians fawn and rival entrepreneurs lose sleep. What no one could bear about Adrian was his invisible size, the size of his silence, his presence, the void he carried in his dark eyes, and the shadow he left wherever he went, as if he could suck the light out of a room. He wasn't just a man. He was an echo, an heir to a dynasty of businessmen, forged in the coldness and silence of family secrets, owners of factories that employed thousands, fortunes built on foundations few dared to question, and pasts whispered about during discreet dinners in London's finest restaurants. The mansion where Adrian lived alone was in Seacliff Point, Cornwall, built upon a cliff that dominated the sea, surrounded by columns of imported marble, opaque tapestries that filtered the sunlight, and works of art that seemed to scream through the empty corridors. He was young, only 32, but time did not pass for him in the same way it did for other men his age. His face bore the severe beauty of someone who had never truly rested, of someone who carried the weight of decisions that had shaped the destinies of others. His soul held the marks of something he couldn't name, an ancestral pain that seemed to have been born with him. No woman ever stayed by his side for long. No love could withstand the perpetual winter that inhabited his chest. Some tried, drawn by the irresistible combination of power and vulnerability he emanated. Others fled within the first week, frightened by the intensity of those eyes that seemed to see right through people. Most fell to their knees before the abyss of loving someone like him, discovering too late that Adrian Cromwell was not a man to be loved by halves. And he accepted this condemnation, with the resignation of one who had learned early on that the fate of the Cromwells was solitude. Adrian knew it was impossible to love him completely because, in his deepest self, he believed that carrying his own name was, in itself, a sin to be paid for in this life. It was on a rainy Tuesday in March that Claire appeared at the mansion, and no one noticed her arrival. She was just another employee sent by the third-party agency that handled the cleaning, a replacement for the overnight cleaner who had quit without explanation. The previous woman had lasted only 3 weeks before leaving in a hurry, claiming the house was too heavy for someone like her. Claire was 23, with small hands calloused from work, eyes as deep as silent pools, and a way of walking as if she were asking the floor for permission with every step. She wore her brown hair in a low bun, simple, clean clothes, and carried a humility that wasn't submission, but rather the quiet strength of someone who had learned to survive without making a sound. But she was not naive, not in the way people usually imagine when they see a simple girl from the countryside. Claire was a virgin in another way, a deeper and more painful one. She had never been touched by true kindness, never known what it was to trust without fear, never experienced desire as something sacred instead of something that hurts. Claire had come from Ashworth, a forgotten town in the north of Cumbria, where she grew up amidst shadows and absences that had marked her soul like invisible scars. Her mother, Marina Saunders, had disappeared when she was only 7 years old, an abrupt and inexplicable vanishing, shrouded in hushed rumors and promises of an investigation that never truly happened. The local police filed the case away after 6 months, citing a lack of evidence and concrete leads. For years, Claire obsessively searched for any trace of her mother. She sifted through yellowed newspaper clippings, spoke with neighbors who barely remembered the quiet woman who had one day simply vanished, and guarded memories like rare treasures. Until, at 21, she finally found a concrete clue hidden among her deceased grandmother's belongings. Her mother had worked as a housekeeper at the Cromwell mansion in Seacliff Point in the months leading up to her disappearance, and she was never seen again. And so, armed with a carefully chosen false name, Claire Saunders became Claire Smith, and with a makeshift but convincing resume, she infiltrated the house of the man who symbolized everything she had learned to fear since childhood. Rich, powerful, untouchable, and at the same time, paradoxically, everything she would begin to desire more intensely than she had ever imagined possible. On her first night of work, Claire met the real Adrian Cromwell. It was 2:30 in the morning when she heard the noise coming from the study on the second floor. A crash, followed by a silence that seemed to last an eternity. Claire climbed the marble stairs slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure whether she should interfere or simply ignore whatever was happening. The study door was ajar, and a yellowish light spilled from it, making shadows dance in the hallway. Claire approached and saw Adrian in the midst of a breakdown. Not an explosive one, with screams and rampant destruction, but something much worse. A contained, icy breakdown as dangerous as a sharp blade. Eek! He was breaking an antique mirror with his bare hands in absolute silence, as if performing a ritual. Blood dripped from between his long, elegant fingers, spotting the Persian rug like drops of red rain, and he seemed not to notice the pain or the injury. His eyes were fixed on his own shattered reflection, as if he were trying to destroy something he saw there that terrified him. Claire stood motionless in the hallway, breathing slowly, not screaming, not running, not making any sound that might interrupt that moment of private madness. She just watched, her eyes welling with a compassion she herself did not understand, seeing in that powerful man a wounded child who did not know how to ask for help. And then, as if he felt the weight of her gaze, Adrian lifted his head and saw her. The world stopped. In his eyes, Claire saw something no woman had ever seen before, the pure surprise of someone being seen for the first time without judgment, without fear, without the expectation that he be different from what he was. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She didn't look at him with pity or horror. She just stood there, a silent witness to his rawest vulnerability. Adrian dropped the mirror shards he was still holding, and they fell to the floor with a musical, sad clatter. The blood continued to flow from his hands, but now he seemed to feel the pain, seemed to have returned from the dark place where he had been moments before. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse as if he hadn't spoken in days. "Claire," she answered simply, taking a step into the study. "I'm here to clean the house." He looked at her as if she were an impossible enigma to decipher, an equation that defied all the logic he knew about the world and its people. "You should have run," Adrian said, his voice laden with a melancholy that seemed to come from far away. "Why?" Claire took another step closer, ignoring the shards scattered on the floor. "Everyone has their bad moments. Yours just happened in the middle of the night." That answer, delivered without insinuation, without games of seduction, without double meanings, pierced something in Adrian that no lover, no therapist, no luxury whim had ever reached. It was as if someone had touched his pain without fear of it splashing onto them, as if someone finally understood that what he needed was not to be deciphered or fixed, but simply accepted, even in the places where he rejected himself. "You don't know me," Adrian murmured, looking at his own bloody hands. "No," Claire agreed, "but I know this pain." And in those simple words lay all the truth Claire carried, the pain of losing someone without understanding why, the pain of growing up without answers, the pain of carrying a void that seemed to have no end. She recognized in the man before her the same fracture that inhabited her own chest, even if their origins were different. Adrian studied her in silence for long minutes, as if trying to memorize every detail of that ordinary face that somehow calmed him. Claire moved across the room, avoiding the shards, and took the first aid kit from a high shelf. "Let me take care of those hands," she said naturally, as if tending to a stranger's wounds were the most normal thing in the world. And for the first time in years, Adrian Cromwell let someone take care of him. Claire cleaned the cuts carefully, applied antiseptic, and bandaged his hands with sure, delicate movements. Adrian watched her work, mesmerized by her concentration, by the way her small hands held his with a firmness that was not possessive, but protective. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" he asked when she had finished dressing the wounds. Claire lifted her eyes and met his gaze directly, and for the first time Adrian saw something familiar in those deep eyes, the same loneliness that inhabited his own. "Because I understand," she replied. "Sometimes we break things when we can't break the pain." That night, as Claire finished her cleaning work, and Adrian remained in the study staring at the shattered mirror, something shifted irrevocably between them. A connection had formed, silent and inevitable as the tide rising on the beach below. In the days that followed, Adrian tried to drive her away in every way he knew. He raised his voice, made impossible demands, created awkward situations, hoping she would quit like all the others. Claire remained. He tested her patience with sudden mood swings, with cruel sarcasm, with the icy silence he often used as a weapon. She did not back down. He tried to intimidate her with his wealth, leaving checks for absurd amounts on the table, offering exorbitant bonuses if she would find work elsewhere. Claire never even touched the money. "Why don't you run away from me?" he asked one night, finding her cleaning the library, his voice full of anger and melancholy. "Everyone runs. Sooner or later, everyone realizes I'm impossible." Claire stopped cleaning the old books and turned to face him for the first time since she had started working there, truly face him, eye to eye, without looking away. "Because I'm different," she answered, with a simplicity that cut through the air like a blade. "I can take it." Those 4 words, "I can take it," spoken without drama, without self-pity, without any intention to impress or seduce, echoed in Adrian's soul like a bell waking the dead. It was the first time in his adult life that someone hadn't promised to love him, change him, or save him. Claire just promised to stay, and somehow that was infinitely more powerful. "You don't know who I am," Adrian said, approaching her with slow steps. "You don't know what I'm capable of." "I know you break mirrors in the middle of the night," Claire replied, without moving away. "I know your hands shake when you're alone. I know you're afraid to sleep. And I know that underneath all that anger, you're just a man who needs someone not to give up on him." The silence that followed was as thick as the fog that sometimes blanketed the mansion on winter mornings. Adrian stood before her, so close that Claire could feel the warmth emanating from his body, could see the small scars marking his hands where she had bandaged them days before. "You'll regret this," he whispered, and in his voice there was both a promise and a warning. "Maybe," Claire admitted, "but not today." And that night, for the first time since he had become an adult, Adrian Cromwell slept without nightmares, knowing there was someone in the house who would not flee from him at dawn. What Claire didn't foresee was that by getting closer to him, by deciding to stay when all others had left, she too would begin to crumble in ways she had never imagined possible. Because loving Adrian Cromwell would be like walking into a fire with her bare hands, knowing she could either get burned or find something on the other side worth every scar. The weeks that followed were like a delicate dance between 2 people learning to trust without haste, without promises, without expectations, beyond the present moment. Claire worked during the early hours of the morning, when the mansion was steeped in silence, and only the sound of the waves broke the quiet of the night. Adrian, who had suffered from chronic insomnia since his teens, began to roam the house at these hours, initially pretending to supervise her work, but gradually admitting to himself that he sought her presence like an addict seeks his drug. Claire cleaned the immense rooms with a dedication that went beyond professional. She touched the antique objects as if they were sacred relics, studied the paintings on the walls as if trying to decipher their secrets, and organized the books in the library with an almost reverent care. She was looking for clues about her mother, of course, but she was also beginning to be genuinely fascinated by the history of this family that seemed to carry the weight of the world on its shoulders. Adrian watched her work, mesmerized by the grace with which she moved through the space, by the way her delicate fingers treated his most precious belongings. No one had ever touched his things with such reverence, as if they understood that each object contained a piece of his fragmented soul. "This painting is beautiful," Claire commented one night, standing before a canvas depicting a stormy sea. "But it's sad." "How do you know?" Adrian asked, approaching from behind her. He was so close he could smell the soft scent she wore, a mix of lavender and something indefinitely feminine that unsettled him. "The painter's eyes," Claire replied, tilting her head to study the work better. "He knew storms, not just the ones at sea." Adrian was silent for a long moment, impressed by her perceptiveness. The painting had been done by his grandfather, a tormented man who had found in art the only way to express the demons that consumed him. "Do you know about art?" "No," Claire admitted, still looking at the painting. "But I know about sadness." It was always like this with her. Simple answers that carried profound truths, observations that went straight to the heart of things without detours or intellectual pretensions. Claire saw the world through the eyes of someone who had learned early on that life is made of painful details and small beauties that must be preserved to keep from going mad. "Tell me about your family," Adrian asked during one of these late-night conversations, as they sat on the veranda overlooking the sea, he with a glass of whiskey and she with a cup of tea she had made in the kitchen. Claire hesitated. Lying to him was becoming more difficult with each passing day, but the truth was still a luxury she couldn't afford. "I don't have a family," she finally said, and this at least was partially true. "I grew up alone." "Your parents?" "Dead," Claire lied, and the word came out more easily than she expected. Technically, her mother could very well be dead. 23 years of silence suggested as much. Adrian nodded, as if he understood the pain of orphanhood perfectly. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the waves crash against the rocks below, each lost in their own ghosts. "I grew up alone too," Adrian said finally, his voice low and laden with a melancholy she was learning to recognize. "Even with living parents, sometimes that's worse." Claire glanced at him, seeing the way he held his glass as if it were an anchor in a stormy sea. "Why worse?" "Because when they die you can idealize them," Adrian explained, taking a long sip. "When they're alive but absent, you have to accept that they chose not to love you enough to stay." The brutal honesty of those words cut through the air between them like a blade, and Claire felt something break inside her chest. For the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, she completely forgot about her secret mission and could only think of the lonely boy Adrian must have been. "Maybe they didn't know how to love," she said softly. "Some people never learn." "And you?" Adrian asked, turning to face her. "Do you know how to love?" The question caught Claire off guard, and she felt her heart dangerously accelerate. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel exposed, as if he could read all her secrets in her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted with sincerity. "I've never had the chance to find out." "Never fallen in love?" Claire shook her head, and it wasn't a lie. The few relationships she'd had were superficial, desperate attempts to feel normal, to pretend she could have an ordinary life despite the hole her mother's absence had left in her soul. "And you?" She returned the question, though she already knew part of the answer. "I don't fall in love," Adrian said with a certainty that sounded almost like a rule. "I obsess." "It's different." "What do you mean?" Adrian was silent for a while, as if deciding how much he could reveal. When he spoke, it was with the voice of someone confessing a sin. "When something interests me, I take it. When someone attracts me, I conquer them. When I desire something, I buy it. But love requires surrender, and I don't know how to surrender. I only know how to possess." The brutality of the confession should have frightened Claire, but instead she felt a deep compassion for this man who condemned himself with such clarity. "Maybe you just haven't found something worth surrendering to," she said, the words slipping out before she could think them through. Adrian looked at her with an intensity that made Claire feel as if she were being seen from the inside out, every thought and feeling laid bare under his penetrating gaze. "Maybe," he murmured, and there was something dangerous in the way he said it, something that made Claire's stomach clench. It was that night that he touched her for the first time. Nothing dramatic or invasive, just his fingers brushing against hers when she stood to leave, and he held her hand for a second longer than necessary. The touch was electric, sending waves of heat up Claire's arm and making her realize she was in far more dangerous territory than she had imagined. "Claire," he said, still holding her hand, and there was something in the way he pronounced her name that made it sound like a prayer. "Yes? Are you afraid of me?" The question was simple but loaded with meaning. Claire could feel the vulnerability behind the words, his genuine fear that she would be just one more person who would eventually run away. "I'm afraid of what you make me feel," Claire admitted, and it was the purest truth she had spoken since arriving at the mansion. Adrian smiled then, a small but genuine smile, the first she had seen on him, and Claire knew in that moment that she was lost in a way there was no coming back from. The days began to blend into a strangely intimate routine. Adrian cancelled business trips to stay home, something he had never done before. He started leaving marked books for Claire, works he thought she would like, small gifts disguised as coincidence. Claire, in turn, began to make tea for two when she arrived, a silent admission that she expected his company. They talked about everything and nothing: books, movies, cheap late-night philosophy, edited childhood memories to hide the most painful secrets. Claire discovered that Adrian had a sarcastic and intelligent sense of humor when he let his guard down, that he knew poetry by heart and sometimes recited verses without realizing it. Adrian discovered that Claire was smarter than she let on, that she voraciously read the books he left for her, that she had strong opinions about social injustice and a heart that bled for the disadvantaged. It was inevitable that the physical attraction would grow along with the emotional intimacy. Claire began to notice things she should ignore: the way the muscles in Adrian's back moved when he stretched, how his long hands seemed both strong and delicate at the same time, how his voice grew deeper when he was relaxed. Adrian, for his part, found himself watching the sway of her hips as she cleaned, the delicate curve of her neck when she tied up her hair, the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating. The sexual tension between them grew until it was almost unbearable, charged with glances that lasted a few seconds too long, accidental touches that left trails of heat on their skin, and conversations that ended abruptly when they got too close to each other. It was on a rainy Thursday that Claire finally found something concrete about her mother. She was cleaning the attic, a space that apparently hadn't been used in years, when she discovered a box hidden behind old furniture. Inside, she found photographs, documents, and a few letters. Her heart stopped when she recognized her mother's familiar handwriting on one of the letters, addressed to someone named only A. "My dearest A," read the first letter, dated almost 24 years earlier. "I know this is wrong. I know I'm betraying everything I believe in, but I can't stop thinking about you. Your hands, your voice, the way you look at me, as if I were the most precious thing in the world." Claire felt the world spin around her. It was a love letter, clearly, but written by the mother she remembered as a serious, religious woman who never spoke of men or romance. And, more disturbingly, the letters were in the Cromwell mansion, which meant this mysterious A had some connection to the family. There were more letters, all following the same passionate and guilty tone. Her mother spoke of secret meetings, of promises whispered in the dark, of a love she knew was impossible but couldn't abandon. And as Claire read, a terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. A could be Albert Cromwell, Adrian's father, who had died 10 years ago in a car accident the newspapers had reported extensively. The dates matched, the initial matched, and the tone of the letters suggested a relationship between an employer and an employee, exactly what her mother had been. Claire was engrossed in her reading when she heard footsteps on the attic stairs. She quickly hid the letters inside her blouse and closed the box, pretending to be cleaning when Adrian appeared at the top of the stairs. "What are you doing up here?" he asked, and there was something different in his voice, a tension she couldn't identify. "Cleaning," Claire replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "You said all the rooms needed to be cleaned." Adrian watched her for a long moment, and Claire had the feeling he could see right through her, that he knew something was wrong. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, approaching. "Just dust and old furniture," Claire lied, hating how easily the lie came to her lips. Adrian nodded, but didn't seem convinced. He looked around the attic as if searching for something specific, and Claire's heart pounded when his eyes landed on the box she had disturbed. "This place hasn't been used in years," he commented casually. "My father kept things up here, things he preferred to forget." The way he said it made Claire realize he knew exactly what was in that box, that perhaps he even knew she had found the letters. The air between them grew thick, heavy with unspoken secrets and dangerous truths. "Claire," Adrian said, moving closer, and there was something in his eyes she had never seen before. Something dark and intense that made her take an instinctive step back. "Yes? If you find something that bothers you, will you promise me you'll talk to me first, before you jump to any conclusions?" It was a strange request, laden with meanings Claire couldn't fully decipher. But there was something in his voice, a vulnerability that cut through all her suspicion. "Why would I find something that bothers me?" she asked, testing him. "Because this house is full of secrets," Adrian admitted, and for the first time since she'd met him, he seemed genuinely afraid. "And not all of them are pretty." Claire stared at him for a long moment, feeling the weight of the hidden letters against her chest, feeling the chasm opening between them. She could tell the truth now, reveal who she was and why she was there, or she could keep lying, digging a hole deeper and deeper, that would eventually collapse on them both. "I promise," she said finally, and they both knew it was one more lie in a series of lies they were building together. That night Claire couldn't sleep. She reread the letters dozens of times, trying to decipher every word, every insinuation. Her mother had been Albert Cromwell's lover. That much was clear. But the letters stopped abruptly more than 23 years ago, exactly around the time her mother disappeared. What had happened? Why had the relationship ended? And why was her mother never seen again? Claire looked out the window of the small flat she had rented in town, seeing Adrian's mansion lit up in the distance, like a sinister beacon in the darkness. She was falling in love with him. She could no longer deny it to herself. But she was also discovering that his family might have destroyed hers, and now she no longer knew if she was seeking justice or revenge, love or self-destruction. Perhaps in the end, they were all the same thing. The weeks following the discovery of the letters were a silent torture for Claire. Every conversation with Adrian seemed to carry double meanings. Every glance from him seemed to hide knowledge she couldn't decipher. The weight of the secrets she carried was beginning to suffocate her, but at the same time her attraction to him grew overwhelmingly, like a poisonous plant that blooms in the dark. Adrian had changed too. There was something more intense in the way he watched her, as if he were studying her every reaction, every word, every gesture. Sometimes Claire would catch him looking at her with an expression that mixed desire and something that looked like suspicion, and in those moments her heart would race with fear and excitement in equal measure. It was on a particularly warm night in April that everything changed between them. Claire was cleaning the library when a storm began outside, with lightning that dramatically illuminated the high windows and thunder that made the crystals on the chandelier tremble. The house's power suddenly failed, plunging everything into complete darkness, broken only by the flashes of lightning. "Claire?" Adrian's voice echoed down the hall, filled with a concern she didn't expect. "I'm here," she answered, trying to get her bearings in the dark. Adrian appeared at the library door with a torch, his face lit from below, creating dramatic shadows that made him look even more handsome and dangerous than usual. "Are you all right?" "I am," Claire said, but her voice trembled slightly. It wasn't fear of the storm, but of the way he was looking at her in the golden light of the torch, as if she were something precious and fragile that needed to be protected. "Come," Adrian said, extending his hand to her. "I'll light the fire in the living room. It's safer there until the power comes back on." Claire hesitated for a second before taking his hand, and the touch was as always. Electric, unsettling, addictive. Adrian led her down the stairs in the darkness, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the masculine scent that made her dizzy. The living room was on the ground floor, a huge space dominated by a stone fireplace that Adrian lit with efficient movements. Soon, the flames began to dance, creating an intimate golden atmosphere that completely transformed the space. "That's better," Adrian said, turning to her. Claire was standing in the middle of the room, illuminated by the fire, and Adrian felt the air leave his lungs. She was beautiful in a way that completely disarmed him. Her hair had come loose from its bun during her work and fell in soft waves over her shoulders, her skin golden in the firelight, her eyes shining with something he couldn't name. "Claire," he said, his voice coming out huskier than he intended. "Yes, I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered. This was it. He knew who she was, knew why she was here. The whole charade was about to fall apart, and she would lose both the chance to find out the truth about her mother and the possibility of being near him. "What is it?" she asked, bracing herself for the worst. "I can't stop thinking about you," Adrian admitted, taking a step toward her. "It's wrong, I know it's wrong, but I can't." Claire stood in silence, absorbing the words that were at once everything she desired and everything she feared to hear. "Why is it wrong?" she finally asked. "Because you work for me," Adrian said, moving closer. "Because I'm older, because I have more power, because—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because everything I touch ends up breaking. And what if I don't care about the risk?" The question slipped out before Claire could think it through, loaded with all the frustration and desire she had been accumulating for weeks. Adrian stopped walking, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed to the soul. "You don't know what you're saying," he murmured. "Yes, I do," Claire said, taking a step toward him now, closing the distance between them until they were face to face. I know exactly what I'm saying." Adrian looked at her for a long moment, and Claire could see the internal battle he was waging, desire fighting against conscience, need against the fear of hurting her. "Claire," he whispered, raising a hand to gently touch her face, "if we start this, there's no going back." "I know," she replied, leaning her face into his palm. And then Adrian kissed her. It was a kiss that started softly, almost hesitantly, as if he were giving her one last chance to run. But when Claire responded, when her hands tangled in his shirt and she pressed herself against his body, something inside him broke. The kiss deepened, became urgent, desperate, charged with weeks of repressed tension. Claire had never felt anything like it. Every touch of his lips sent waves of pleasure through her entire body. Every caress of his large hands on her back made her tremble with desire. She understood now why other women got lost in him, why they became addicted to the intensity he offered. Adrian kissed her like a thirsty man would kiss the rain, as if she were the salvation he had been searching for his whole life without knowing it. His hands roamed her body with an almost religious reverence, as if he were memorizing every curve, every reaction. "Are you sure?" he asked against her lips, his voice hoarse with desire. "I am," Claire lied, because the only thing she was sure of was that she couldn't stop, even knowing she was heading for an abyss. Adrian carried her in his arms to the leather sofa near the fireplace, and there they made love for the first time with a passion that surprised them both with its intensity. He was careful with her, instinctively sensing her inexperience, guiding her with a gentleness that contrasted with the urgency he felt. Claire surrendered completely, discovering sensations she never knew existed, losing herself in the warmth and strength of this man who consumed her entirely. When they finished, they lay tangled together in the golden light of the fire, their bodies still trembling with pleasure and emotion. Adrian gently stroked her hair, and Claire could feel his heart beating strongly against her chest. "Are you all right?" he asked, and there was a tenderness in his voice she had never heard before. "I'm more than all right," Claire admitted, and it was true. For the first time in years, she felt whole, as if a part of her that had been lost had finally been found. "Claire," Adrian said, turning to face her, "I need you to know this isn't a game for me. You're not just another one." The words should have reassured her, but instead they only increased the weight of the guilt she carried. How could she match his sincerity when her entire presence there was based on a lie? "It isn't for me either," she said, and at least that much was true. They went back to his room that night, and Claire discovered a side of Adrian he kept carefully hidden from the world. He was tender, attentive, vulnerable in a way that left her defenseless. They made love again, more slowly this time, exploring each other with a curiosity and affection that turned every touch into a promise. But it was when Adrian fell asleep in her arms that Claire realized the true scale of the trouble she was in. Looking at his relaxed face, at the lines of tension that softened in sleep, she realized she was irrevocably in love. It was no longer a matter of finding the truth about her mother or seeking justice. It was love, pure and simple and impossible. Because how could she love the son of the man who had possibly destroyed her family? How could she be happy in the arms of someone whose blood might carry the guilt for her mother's disappearance? In the days that followed, Claire and Adrian fell into an intimate routine that was both wonderful and terrifying. He cancelled all non-essential appointments to spend more time at home, inventing excuses to see her during the day, in addition to the nights they now spent together. Claire was still officially the cleaner, but in practice she had become much more: confidant, lover, the only person capable of calming the demons that haunted Adrian. He told her stories of his lonely childhood, of the cold relationship with parents who saw him more as an heir than a son. Claire listened, offered comfort, but always with the terrible feeling that she was betraying both him and her own mother by accepting this intimacy. "My father was a complicated man," Adrian said one afternoon, as they lay in bed after a session of lovemaking that had left them exhausted and sated. "Powerful, successful, but cold. I never saw him show genuine affection for anyone." Claire's heart tightened. Here was the opening she was looking for to ask questions about the past, but also the confirmation of her worst fears about the kind of man Albert Cromwell had been. "Did he mistreat you?" she asked softly. "Not physically," Adrian replied, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. But there was a subtle cruelty in the way he ignored me, as if I were another piece of property rather than a son. And with women? He paused as if deciding how much to reveal. What about women? He had affairs, Adrian said finally. Many affairs. My mother knew, we all knew, but no one talked about it. It was part of the power he wielded, I think. Taking what he wanted when he wanted. A chill went down Claire's spine. What kind of affairs? Employees mostly, Adrian said, and his voice carried a sadness that wasn't just for his own experience. Women in vulnerable positions who couldn't say no. I was a child, but not blind. I saw how terrified they were when he approached, how some of them would just disappear from one day to the next. The words fell like stones in the pit of Claire's stomach. Her mother had been one of those women. Vulnerable, dependent on her job, unable to defend herself from a rich and powerful man who took what he wanted. And you never said anything. I was a child, Adrian repeated, but there was guilt in his voice. And then, when I grew up, he died. What could I have done? What? Bring back the women he hurt? Claire fell silent, fighting back the tears that threatened to overflow. Here was the confirmation that her mother had been a victim, but also the revelation that Adrian carried guilt for his father's behavior. He wasn't the monster she had feared she would find, but a wounded man trying to cope with the toxic legacy of his family. Claire, are you all right? Adrian asked, noticing her tension. I'm fine, she lied again. It's just sad knowing these things happen. Adrian pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head with a gentleness that made her heart shatter a little more. That's why I was afraid to touch you, he confessed. I'm terrified of being like him, of using my power to pressure someone in a vulnerable position. You're not like him, Claire said with more conviction than she felt. You're kind, careful. With you, yes, Adrian admitted. You awakened something in me I didn't know existed. Something good. Claire closed her eyes, finally letting the tears fall silently. How could she destroy his happiness, their happiness, with revelations about a past he couldn't change? How could she seek revenge against someone already dead, especially when it would mean losing the love of her life? Because that's what Adrian had become, the love of her life. The person she was willing to give up everything for, including her own identity and the desire for justice that had brought her here. But the universe, apparently, had other plans. 3 days after that conversation, Claire found something that would change everything. She was organizing documents in Adrian's study, a task he had specifically asked her to do, when she found an old folder at the back of a sticking drawer. Inside the folder were photos, legal documents, and something that made her blood run cold, a death certificate. Marina Saunders, her mother, had officially died 23 years ago, according to that document. The cause of death was listed as accidental, but there were no details about what kind of accident or where it had occurred. And more sinisterly, the document was signed by a doctor whom Claire discovered, with a quick online search, had lost his license years later for falsifying certificates. Her mother hadn't just disappeared, she had died. And someone had forged documents to hide the circumstances of her death. Claire was still absorbing this devastating information when she found the photographs at the bottom of the folder. They were photos of her mother, younger than any she owned, showing Marina pregnant, very pregnant. And on the back of one of the photos, in a handwriting she recognized as Albert Cromwell's, was written, "Marina, 8 months, our secret." Claire sank heavily into the study chair, the reality hitting her like a tidal wave. Her mother hadn't just been Albert Cromwell's lover, she had become pregnant by him. And the date on the back of the photo suggested that Claire was not the daughter of the man she had always believed to be her father, but Albert's, which meant that Adrian wasn't just the son of the man who had destroyed her family, he was her half-brother, and she had fallen in love with him, given her body and soul to him, without any idea of the horrible truth they carried. Claire threw up right there in the study's wastebasket, her body rejecting the reality her mind was trying to process. When she managed to compose herself minimally, she gathered the photos and documents with trembling hands and ran out of the mansion as if pursued by the demons of hell. Because, in a way, that's exactly what was happening. Claire didn't return to the mansion for 3 days. She locked herself in the small flat she had rented in town, throwing up every time she tried to eat, shaking as if she had a fever, fighting against a reality that cut through all her certainties like a blade. She couldn't stop thinking about the photographs, the forged death certificate, the terrifying possibility that Adrian was her half-brother. The memory of his hands on her body, the kisses they shared, the way he whispered her name in the dark. It had all turned into something obscene and unbearable. But what if she was wrong? What if the photographs meant something else? The handwriting on the back might not be Albert Cromwell's. Her mother's pregnancy could have been by another man at another time. Claire clung to these possibilities, like a drowning person clings to any floating object, even knowing deep down that she was deceiving herself. The phone rang incessantly. Messages from Adrian arrived in a desperate sequence that broke her heart in different ways with each reading. "Claire, where are you? I'm worried. Please answer me. I need to know if you're okay. If I did something wrong, tell me, we can talk. Claire, please don't leave me like this." And finally, the message that broke her completely. "I love you. Whatever the problem is, we'll solve it together." Claire cried until she had no tears left, clutching the phone to her chest as if she could feel Adrian through the screen. He loved her. She loved him. And shouldn't that be something beautiful instead of something horrific? It was on the third day of self-isolation that the doorbell rang. Claire opened the door expecting the food delivery she had ordered, but instead came face to face with a man who made her take an instinctive step back. He was handsome in a different way from Adrian, more delicate, with light eyes and blonde hair that contrasted with his tanned skin. But there was something familiar in his features that unsettled her. "Are you Claire Saunders?" he asked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Who's asking?" "My name is Henry Cromwell," he said, and Claire felt the world spin again. "I believe we have a lot to talk about." Claire stared at him in silence for a long moment, trying to process what she was hearing. Another Cromwell, as if the situation wasn't complicated enough. "I don't know any Henry Cromwell," she finally said. "No, but you know my half-brother Adrian," Henry replied, and there was something in the way he said the name that sounded almost like venom. "And I believe you've also found some interesting photographs and documents recently." Claire's blood ran cold. How could he know about that? "I don't know what you're talking about." "Claire," Henry said with exaggerated patience, "may I come in? We really need to talk, and this isn't a conversation to have in the hallway." Against her better judgment, Claire opened the door and let him in. Henry looked around the simple flat with an interest that seemed genuine. None of the disdain she would expect from someone in the Cromwell family. "Nice place," he commented, sitting on the sofa uninvited. "Simple but cozy. Very different from the mansion, I imagine." "How do you know where I live?" Claire asked, remaining on her feet, ready to run if necessary. "I know many things, Claire," Henry said, leaning back comfortably. "For example, I know you're not really a cleaner. I know your real name is Claire Saunders, not Smith. I know your mother's name was Marina, and that she disappeared over 20 years ago. And I know you came to Seacliff Point specifically to investigate what happened to her." Claire felt her legs go weak and grabbed the back of a chair to keep from falling. "How?" "Because I've also been investigating my family's crimes," Henry said simply. "And believe me, there are far more secrets buried than you can imagine." "Who are you?" Claire asked, her voice a mere whisper. "I am the bastard son of Albert Cromwell," Henry explained with a bitter smile. "The result of one of the many affairs my father had during his marriage. My mother was French, a model he met on a business trip. When he found out she was pregnant, he paid her to go away and never come back. I grew up in France, believing my father was a good man who had died before I was born." Claire watched him with a mixture of fascination and horror, noticing the resemblances she had initially seen. Henry had the same dark eyes as Adrian, the same strong jawline. "And what do you want with me?" "Justice," Henry said simply. "For my mother, for yours, for all the women Albert Cromwell destroyed over the years. I found out the truth about who he really was 2 years ago, when my mother died and left me letters she had kept for 3 decades. Since then, I've been gathering evidence, documents, testimonies." "And Adrian?" Claire asked, the name coming painfully from her lips. "Adrian doesn't know I exist," Henry admitted. "At least not yet. But he knows about your mother, he always has." The words fell like bombs in the silence of the flat. "What do you mean?" "Adrian was at the mansion the night your mother died," Henry said, watching Claire's every reaction. "He was 8 years old at the time. He saw his father kill Marina Saunders in an argument that got out of control, and he's kept it a secret all these years." Claire felt the floor open up beneath her. "No. It couldn't be true. Adrian couldn't have witnessed her mother's murder and never said a thing. Not the kind, vulnerable man she had fallen in love with. "You're lying," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Henry took an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I have here a sworn statement from a nurse who worked for the family at the time. She confirms that Adrian witnessed everything and that Albert threatened to kill him too if he ever told anyone." Claire took the document with trembling hands, reading the words that destroyed her world completely. The nurse described in detail how she had found Adrian hiding behind a curtain, in a state of shock after witnessing Albert strangle Marina Saunders during an argument about the end of their relationship. "He was a child," Claire whispered, trying to cling to anything that might justify Adrian's silence. "He was," Henry agreed, "but he's not anymore. And in the last 24 years, he's had countless opportunities to tell the truth. Instead, he chose to protect his father's legacy and live off a fortune built on blood and suffering." Claire dropped the document, feeling physically sick. Everything she had believed about Adrian was crumbling, every sweet memory turning into something sinister and calculated. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I need your help," Henry said, leaning forward. "Alone, I don't have enough power to bring down the Cromwell Empire. But you're inside the house, you have access to the documents, to Adrian's trust. Together we can expose everything. And what do I get out of it?" "Justice for your mother," Henry said. "And the truth about who Adrian really is beneath that facade of a wounded, vulnerable man." Claire was silent for a long time, her brain trying to process all the devastating information she had received. Adrian knew about her mother. He had always known. And yet he had seduced her, made love to her, whispered sweet words while carrying the most horrific secret of her life. "There's one more thing," Henry said, as if it were an afterthought. "About the paternity." Claire's heart stopped. "What about the paternity?" "Your mother was pregnant when she died. You already know that," Henry said calmly. "But the baby wasn't Albert's. It was from another man, someone she had met after ending the affair with my father. The DNA tests I managed to run confirm it. You are not Adrian's sister." Claire felt as if she had been struck by lightning. The relief was so intense that for a moment she couldn't breathe. "How did you—" "I got a sample of your DNA from a cup you used at a cafe in town," Henry explained, without any sign of embarrassment for the invasion of privacy. "And I have genetic material from Albert from old medical exams. There's no relation." Claire sank into a chair, her legs finally giving way. So she could love Adrian without the horror of incest, but she couldn't love a man who had hidden her mother's murder his entire life. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice dead. "Go back to the mansion," Henry said. "Keep pretending you don't know anything. Look for more evidence, documents that can prove Albert's guilt and Adrian's complicity. When we have enough material, we'll make it all public. And then?" "Then Adrian loses everything," Henry said with a satisfaction that chilled Claire's blood. "The fortune, the reputation, possibly his freedom if we can prove he was an accessory after the fact." Claire looked at Henry for a long moment, seeing for the first time the calculated coldness hiding behind his charming appearance. He didn't just want justice, he wanted revenge. He wanted to destroy Adrian as much as he wanted to expose the truth about Albert. "And if I say no?" "Then I do it alone," Henry said with a shrug. "But it will be much harder, and there's a chance Adrian will escape the consequences. Is that what you want? For the man who kept the secret of your mother's murder to continue living his privileged life as if nothing ever happened?" Claire closed her eyes, feeling the weight of a decision that would change everything. On one hand, Adrian had lied to her about something fundamental. On the other, he was just a child when it happened, traumatized and terrified. Could she blame him for protecting a secret that protected his own life? "I need time to think," she said finally. "You have 3 days," Henry said, getting up. "After that, I'll proceed with or without your help." He walked to the door but stopped before leaving. "Claire," he said, turning to face her one last time, "I know you're in love with him. But remember, every time you made love, every time he whispered that he loved you, he knew he was kissing the daughter of the woman his father murdered. And he chose not to tell you." And with those poisoned words, Henry left, leaving Claire alone with the weight of an impossible decision. That night, Claire finally replied to Adrian's messages. "I'm fine. I'll be back tomorrow." The reply came almost immediately. "Thank God. I missed you so much. I love you." Claire stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without responding. because now those words were no longer a balm for her wounded soul. They were just another layer in the web of lies that enmeshed her life, and she still didn't know if, when she returned to Adrian's arms the next night, it would be as the woman who loved him or as the agent of the destruction he deserved. Claire returned to the mansion the next night, with a heart as heavy as lead and a crystal-clear decision in her mind. She would tell Adrian everything. It didn't matter what the consequences were. It didn't matter if he would hate her or if she would lose his love forever. She could no longer live with lies, especially now that she knew he also carried secrets that directly involved her. Adrian was waiting for her at the entrance, and the explosion of relief in his eyes when she appeared was like a stab to Claire's chest. He ran to her, like a man who had spent 3 days in hell, pulling her into his arms with an urgency that spoke of genuine desperation. "Thank God," he murmured against her hair, holding her as if he feared she might disappear again. "I thought I'd lost you." Claire let him hold her for a moment, memorizing the feeling of being in his arms because she suspected it might be the last time. Then she gently pulled away, just enough to look him in the eyes. "Adrian, we need to talk." Something in the seriousness of her voice made the joy vanish from his face, replaced by a caution she recognized immediately. It was the same expression he wore when he sensed trouble in his business dealings. "About what?" "About my mother, about Albert Cromwell, about everything." Adrian's face visibly paled, and Claire knew in that moment that Henry had told the truth. Adrian knew. He had always known. "Claire." "No," she said, holding up a hand to silence him. "First, I talk. Then you give me the explanations you should have given me weeks ago." Adrian nodded slowly, but she could see the panic growing in his dark eyes. "My real name is Claire Saunders," she began, watching his every reaction. "My mother's name was Marina Saunders. She worked here as a housekeeper over 20 years ago. And you know exactly who she was." Adrian closed his eyes as if he'd been punched in the gut. "I came here to find out what happened to her," Claire continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "because one day she just disappeared, and I've spent my entire life wondering why. Now I know. Claire, please let me explain." "Your father killed her," she said brutally, watching as the words made Adrian recoil as if he'd been slapped. "And you saw it. You were just a child, but you saw everything." Adrian sank into a nearby chair, his face now completely white. His hands were trembling visibly, and Claire could see he was struggling to breathe normally. "How did you find out?" he asked, his voice strangled. "Does it matter? What matters is that you knew from the very first day who I was, why I was here, and you chose not to tell me. It's not that simple, isn't it?" Claire felt all the anger and pain of the last few days finally explode. "You made love to me knowing my mother died in this house. You whispered sweet words in my ear while keeping the most important secret of my life." "I was 8 years old," Adrian suddenly shouted, rising from the chair with a violence that made Claire flinch. "8, Claire. Do you think an 8-year-old child understands the implications of what he sees? Do you think I consciously chose to keep this secret?" "But you chose as an adult," Claire retorted. "Every day for 24 years you chose not to tell the truth." "Because tell who?" Adrian's voice was filled with a pain so deep that Claire felt her anger momentarily waver. "The police my father bought, the journalists he controlled, the society that revered him as a pillar of the community? Me," Claire said simply. "You could have told me." The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Adrian looked at her with an expression of total desolation, as if he had just realized he had lost the one thing that truly mattered to him. "You're right," he finally admitted, his voice a mere whisper. "I should have told you. From the very first moment I should have said who you were, what I knew, but what? But for the first time in my life I was happy," he said, the words torn from him as if by force. "For the first time I loved someone and was loved back, and I knew that if I told the truth I would lose you. So you lied to me." "Yes," Adrian admitted without trying to defend himself. "I lied. I was a coward. I chose my happiness over your peace." The brutal honesty of his confession momentarily disarmed Claire. She had expected denials, justifications, maybe even threats. She hadn't expected him to simply admit his guilt without reservation. "Tell me what you saw," she said after a long moment. Adrian sat down again, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of despair. "I couldn't sleep that night," he began. his gaze lost in painful memories. It was almost 2 a.m. when I heard raised voices coming from my father's study. I went down to see what was happening. Claire sat down too, preparing herself to hear the truth she had sought for so long. My father was arguing with a woman, Adrian continued. She was crying, begging him to let her leave in peace. She said she didn't want anything more from him. She just wanted to raise her daughter away from that whole situation. Claire's heart ached, imagining her mother in that desperate situation. He wouldn't let her. He was furious, Adrian said, and Claire could see that reliving the memory was physically painful for him. He said no bloody housekeeper was going to blackmail a Cromwell, that if she didn't keep quiet and accept what he offered, she and her daughter would pay the price. And then? She said she was going to tell my mother everything, tell the press, that he couldn't treat people like disposable objects. Adrian paused, breathing heavily. That's when he completely lost control. Claire felt tears burning her eyes but didn't let them fall. Did he strangle her? It wasn't premeditated, Adrian said quickly, as if that made any difference. It was a fit of rage. He pushed her against the wall, put his hands on her neck. I think he just wanted to scare her, but she died. Yes. The word came out as a broken sigh. And when he realized what he'd done, when he saw her body on the floor, he just panicked. He started shouting, pacing back and forth, muttering about ruining the family, the company. And you were watching everything. Hiding behind the curtains, Adrian confirmed. Paralyzed with terror, and then he saw me. Claire held her breath. What did he do? First, he was silent for a long time, just staring at me, Adrian recalled, and she could see the haunted 8-year-old boy in the adult man's eyes. Then he came closer, knelt in front of me, and said that if I told anyone what I had seen, he would kill me too. He said no one would believe a child over his word anyway. My God. But the worst part, Adrian continued, his voice breaking, was when he said it might be better if I died anyway, because then there would be no witnesses. I thought he was going to kill me right there. I waited for hours for death to come. Claire felt all her anger dissolve, replaced by a deep compassion for the terrified boy Adrian had been. How could she blame a child for not having the courage an adult would struggle to muster? How did he get rid of the body? He paid people to make it disappear, Adrian said. And he created a story about her quitting and leaving to take care of sick relatives in another part of the country. Since she was discreet, few people asked questions. And you never spoke of it again. I tried once, Adrian admitted. A few years later, when I was a teenager, and started to better understand what had happened. But he reminded me that I was an accomplice now, that if the truth came out I would be judged as an accessory to the crime. He said the only thing keeping me alive was our mutual silence. Claire closed her eyes, trying to process it all. Adrian's version was different from the one Henry had told. It wasn't the story of a privileged heir protecting his family's legacy, but of a perpetual victim of trauma and manipulation. Claire, Adrian said softly, I know I have no right to ask this after all the lies I've told you, but can you forgive me? Claire looked at him for a long moment, seeing the man she loved, broken by guilt and the fear of losing her. I don't know, she admitted honestly, but I want to try. The relief that washed over Adrian's face was almost palpable. There's one more thing I need to tell you, Claire said, about a man named Henry Cromwell. The shift in Adrian's expression was immediate. Confusion, followed by recognition, followed by something that looked like panic. How do you know about Henry? He came to see me 3 days ago, said he's your bastard half-brother. Damn it, Adrian muttered. I knew he'd show up eventually. You know him? I know of his existence, Adrian admitted. I found documents about an illegitimate son in France when I was organizing my father's papers after he died, but I never tried to make contact. I thought it was better to let him live his life away from all this madness. Well, he's here now, and he wants your head on a platter. Adrian sighed deeply. What did he say? Claire told him everything. Henry's allegations, his proposal for collaboration, the veiled threats. Adrian listened in silence, his face growing progressively darker. He's not wrong about one thing, Adrian said when she finished. I am an accomplice. I kept a murder secret for over 2 decades. Technically, that makes me a criminal. You were a terrified child. But I'm not anymore, Adrian retorted. And I chose to remain silent as an adult. That has consequences. It was at that moment they heard the sound of cars pulling up to the mansion's entrance. Many cars, judging by the sound. Adrian and Claire looked at each other, a terrible understanding passing between them. "Henry," Claire said. "Not alone," Adrian observed, getting up and walking to the window. "Police." Claire's stomach sank. Henry had carried out his threat. Without waiting for her answer, he had taken everything to the authorities. The doorbell rang, followed by firm knocks on the main door. "Adrian Cromwell," an authoritative voice shouted. "Police, open the door." Adrian turned to Claire, and she saw a strange, almost serene acceptance in his eyes. "This is the end," he said simply. "No," Claire said with more strength than she felt. "This is just the beginning. We're going to face this together." "Claire, together," she repeated firmly, taking his hand. "I'm not running now. Not after everything." And for the first time since she had discovered the truth about her mother, Claire felt a strange peace settle in her chest. The truth was finally coming to light. It would be painful, it would be devastating, but at least it would be real. The knocking on the door intensified, but Claire and Adrian remained there for another moment, hands clasped, preparing to face together the consequences of secrets that had been buried for far too long. "I love you," Adrian whispered. "I love you too," Claire replied. "And that's why we're going to survive this." Then Adrian walked to the door to finally let justice in, knowing that whatever happened next, he would not face the consequences of his father's sins alone. The 6 months that followed the police's arrival were the longest and most painful of Claire and Adrian's lives, but also the most transformative. What began as a criminal investigation turned into a journey of healing and redemption that neither of them could have anticipated. Adrian was initially detained on suspicion of complicity in the murder of Marina Saunders, but his lawyer, one of the best criminal barristers in the country, secured his release on bail after presenting compelling arguments about his childhood trauma and the psychological coercion he had suffered. The fact that Adrian had been just a child at the time of the crime weighed heavily in his favor, especially when child trauma experts confirmed that his reactions had been typical of a victim of severe psychological abuse. Henry, initially triumphant at having brought the truth to light, gradually realized that his thirst for revenge against his brother had been misdirected. During the interrogations and hearings, it became clear that Adrian had been as much a victim as Claire, just in a different way. Albert Cromwell had destroyed many lives, including that of his own son, whom he had terrorized to ensure his silence. Claire testified on Adrian's behalf, a decision many didn't understand, but which she knew was the only right one. During her emotional testimony, she explained how Adrian had carried that trauma for decades, how the weight of the secret had shaped his entire personality, creating the tormented and isolated man she had come to know. "My mother would not want to see another life destroyed because of the violence she suffered," Claire declared during the trial, her words echoing through the silent courtroom. "Adrian was a child when this happened, a terrified child who was manipulated and threatened. He is not the enemy. He is another victim of the man who can no longer answer for his crimes." The trial lasted 4 months, with Adrian cooperating fully with the authorities, providing every detail he could remember, and handing over documents he found in his father's files that could help other victims. His honesty and genuine remorse impressed even the most skeptical prosecutor. In the end, Adrian was sentenced to community service and ordered to compensate the families of other victims of Albert Cromwell who were identified during the investigation. He lost a significant portion of the family fortune but didn't care. In fact, for the first time in years, he seemed genuinely at peace. "Every pound that leaves the family account to help these people is a weight off my shoulders," he told Claire, in one of the many conversations they had during those difficult months. "I should have done this years ago." Henry, seeing his brother's genuine transformation and finally understanding the complexity of the situation, gradually abandoned his hostility. The two brothers began to truly get to know each other, now united by a mutual understanding of how Albert had harmed them both, albeit in different ways. Henry decided to stay in the UK and use his share of the inheritance to create a foundation supporting victims of domestic violence, a project Adrian enthusiastically supported. For Claire, those months were an emotional roller coaster. There were moments when she doubted her decision to stand by Adrian, moments when the pain for her mother seemed greater than the love she felt for him. But gradually, with the help of therapy and Adrian's unconditional support, she managed to separate the man she loved from the crimes of his father. The most significant change came when Claire found the letters her mother had written but never sent, discovered during a deeper search of the family's documents. In them, Marina Saunders expressed her love for her daughter and her regret for the destructive relationship she had become involved in. But more importantly, she wrote about her dreams for Claire's future, about her hope that her daughter would find the true love and happiness she herself had never managed to achieve. "My dearest Claire," one letter read, "if anything happens to me, I want you to know that the only thing that gives me peace is knowing you will grow up free from the chains that bound me. You are strong, stronger than I ever was, and when you find true love, don't let the mistakes of the past destroy it. The human heart has an infinite capacity to heal and forgive, if we let it." It was in reading these words that Claire finally understood that her mother would not want her to sacrifice her happiness on the altar of revenge. Marina Saunders had died dreaming of a better future for her daughter, and that future was in Claire's hands to build. Adrian, for his part, used those months to finally confront his own demons. In addition to intensive therapy to deal with his childhood trauma, he dedicated himself completely to repairing the damage caused by his family. He liquidated questionable businesses, fired corrupt executives, and restructured the Cromwell Company to be an example of social responsibility and corporate ethics. "I want the Cromwell name to mean something different from now on," he told Claire, as they signed the documents creating the Marina Saunders Foundation, dedicated to providing legal and psychological support for women in abusive relationships. "I want it to mean healing instead of pain." Adrian's transformation was profound and genuine. The dark, tormented man Claire had met gave way to someone lighter, more open, more capable of living in the present instead of being consumed by the past. For the first time in his life, he was sleeping without nightmares, smiling without reservation, loving without fear, and Claire blossomed beside him. She left her cleaning job and enrolled in a psychology degree, discovering a vocation for helping others process trauma and find healing. Adrian supported her studies with pride, often joking that she was smarter than him and that he had always known it. Their relationship deepened in ways neither of them had imagined possible. The crisis had burned away all the masks, all the pretenses, leaving only the raw truth of two hearts that had chosen each other despite everything. They learned to talk about everything, to share fears and hopes, to build something new on the ashes of the past. It was on a December evening, exactly 1 year after Claire's arrival at the mansion, that Adrian asked her to marry him. It was nothing grand or dramatic, just the two of them on the veranda where they had shared so many conversations, looking out at the sea that had witnessed so much suffering, but now reflected the possibility of a different future. "I know our beginning was complicated," he said, holding her hands in his. "I know we carry scars that will never completely fade, but I also know that I love you more than I ever thought it possible to love someone, and that you make me want to be a better man every day." Claire looked at the simple, beautiful ring he offered. It wasn't ostentatious or overly expensive, just perfect for her, and felt her heart overflow with happiness. "The answer is yes," she said, smiling through tears of joy. "It was always yes, even when I didn't know it." The wedding took place 6 months later, a small but meaningful ceremony on the beach in front of the mansion, which had now been transformed into a support center for women victims of violence. Henry was Adrian's best man, a symbol of the family reconciliation that had seemed impossible just a year before. Claire carried a bouquet of wildflowers and a photo of her mother, and during the ceremony she felt Marina's presence like a blessing on their new beginning. At the reception after the ceremony, as they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Adrian whispered in Claire's ear, "Thank you for not giving up on me, for seeing past my mistakes and believing I could be better. Thank you for letting me love you," Claire replied, "for teaching me that sometimes love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to grow together with someone imperfect." 2 years later, Claire graduated with her psychology degree and opened her own practice, specializing in trauma therapy. Adrian transformed the family business into a model of social responsibility, creating decent jobs and community support programs. Together, they established the Marina Saunders Network, a national organization providing resources and support for families shattered by violence. Henry married a British lawyer he met during the legal proceedings and decided to make the UK his permanent home. The two brothers developed a close, collaborative relationship, working together on various social projects and discovering they had much more in common than just DNA. The mansion at Seacliff Point was transformed into a temporary shelter for women and children fleeing domestic violence. Claire and Adrian built a smaller, cozier home on a nearby hill, with gardens where Claire planted roses in her mother's memory, and a study where Adrian worked on his memoirs, telling his story to help other victims of childhood trauma. 5 years after they met, as Claire cradled their first child, a daughter named Marina, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. The love that had begun with lies and secrets had transformed into something pure and true, built on total honesty and mutual acceptance. She would have been proud, Adrian said softly, watching Claire nurse their daughter on the veranda where it all began. Who? Your mother. Of everything you've become, of how you've turned pain into purpose. Claire smiled, kissing little Marina's head. I hope so. I hope that wherever she is, she knows the story didn't end with sadness. That it ended with love. Adrian sat beside her, putting his arm around her shoulders and looking out at the sea that was no longer a source of melancholy, but a symbol of infinite possibilities. Our story is still being written, he said, and every chapter gets better. Mostly because we're writing it together now, Claire replied. And there on the veranda where two wounded souls had met on a stormy night, a new family was growing on the foundations of forgiveness, healing, and a love that had proven stronger than any secret from the past. The echo of silence had finally been broken by the sound of true happiness, and Marina Saunders, wherever she was, could rest in peace, knowing her daughter had found not only justice, but also the enduring love she herself had dreamed of for Claire. The sun set over Seacliff Point that evening, painting the sky in gold and rose, the colors of hope and new beginnings. And for the first time in decades, the mansion on the cliff echoed not with sadness or secrets, but with a child's laughter, loving conversations, and the soft music of a family that had chosen love over resentment, healing over revenge. Claire Saunders Cromwell had found her own voice, and it was a voice that sang of joy.